An oil facility burning in the Gulf. Commercial ships suddenly stopping movement. American destroyers moving into combat positions. And within hours of Trump announcing a new military operation, Iran responds. Not with a statement, not with a warning, but with drones, missiles, and coordinated pressure across one of the most important waterways on Earth. Now here's the part most people are missing. This may not simply be a conflict between America and Iran, because underneath the headlines, underneath the dramatic footage, there appears to be a much larger strategic game unfolding, a game involving energy, global trade, military pressure, and the possibility that some countries benefit financially the longer the crisis continues. Tonight, we're going beyond the breaking news version. We're looking at the timing, the strategy, the diplomatic moves, and why the events surrounding Project Freedom may reveal a much deeper geopolitical reality than most official briefings are willing to admit. Because when you connect the sequence carefully, the picture starts looking very different. The timing that changed everything. Let's begin with the timeline. Because timing is everything in geopolitics. On May 3rd, President Donald Trump announces what his administration describes as Project Freedom. The stated goal: protect commercial shipping, secure navigation routes, and stabilize the Strait of Hormuz after weeks of escalating regional tension. American naval assets begin repositioning almost immediately. Guided missile destroyers, carrier support aircraft, maritime surveillance planes, thousands of military personnel placed on heightened alert. Officially, the messaging is controlled and measured: strength, deterrence, protection of international commerce. But then something happens that completely changes the conversation. Within hours of the announcement, reports begin emerging of coordinated Iranian military activity. Drone launches, fast attack boat maneuvers, missile activity near shipping lanes, and eventually a major strike connected to energy infrastructure in the UAE. Now think carefully about that sequence. This wasn't a response developing over several days. It wasn't a chaotic reaction. It appeared organized, prepared, layered, and that immediately raises a serious question. How does a military operation involving drones, maritime units, missile coordination, and regional targeting unfold so quickly unless at least parts of that response architecture were already prepared in advance? That question matters, because if the response was pre-planned, then Project Freedom may have entered a strategic environment that was already waiting for it. And that changes the story completely. Most viewers see explosions and headlines, but military planners see logistics, preparation, positioning, coordination timelines. And when analysts study rapid escalation events, one thing becomes extremely important: what was already in motion before the public announcement. That's where this story begins shifting away from a simple military confrontation and toward something much larger. Why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. To understand why this situation is so dangerous, you first need to understand the Strait of Hormuz itself. This isn't just another waterway. It's one of the most strategically important energy corridors on the planet. A massive percentage of global oil and liquefied natural gas shipments move through this narrow passage. If traffic there slows down, the entire global economy feels it. Oil prices rise, insurance rates surge, shipping delays spread, financial markets react, and countries dependent on stable energy imports suddenly face economic pressure. That's why even limited disruptions inside Hormuz create global consequences. Now add military tension on top of that. Drones over shipping lanes, missiles near infrastructure, warships escorting commercial vessels. Every move becomes high risk, because one mistake, one miscalculation, can rapidly escalate beyond anyone's original intention. And here's something else that matters. Not every major power is equally vulnerable to Hormuz disruption. Some countries spent years building alternative energy routes, pipeline systems, Arctic shipping access, long-term energy agreements, overland trade corridors. In other words, some powers are more insulated from Gulf instability than others. And once you understand that, You begin seeing why prolonged instability can create strategic advantages for certain countries even if they never directly enter the battlefield themselves. That's the uncomfortable reality sitting underneath this crisis. Sometimes geopolitical power isn't about who fires the missile. Sometimes it's about who benefits from the disruption. The Russia-Iran connection. Now this is where the story becomes even more important. Months before the current escalation, Russia and Iran publicly expanded strategic cooperation, joint economic discussions, military coordination, regional security agreements, diplomatic alignment. Now, to be clear, that does not automatically mean Russia controls Iranian military decisions. There is no public evidence proving direct operational command. But what it does suggest is something equally significant: a shared strategic interest. And in international politics, shared strategic interests can reshape entire conflicts. Think about the incentives. If global energy prices rise because Gulf shipping becomes unstable, major energy exporters benefit financially. If American military resources become tied down in prolonged regional operations, that affects broader global competition. If Washington is forced to spend enormous amounts maintaining security operations, that creates pressure economically and politically. And this is where many analysts believe the real battlefield exists. Not just missiles, not just drones, but endurance, cost, and strategic pressure over time. Because modern geopolitical competition isn't always about winning quickly. Sometimes it's about making your rivals spend more resources than they expected. More ships, more deployments, more money, more political capital. And if the conflict remains unresolved long enough, the pressure compounds. That's why many experts are now focusing less on individual military exchanges and more on whether Project Freedom can remain sustainable over weeks and months. Can shipping truly normalize? Can regional allies remain confident? Can escalation remain controlled? Those are the real strategic questions, because tactical victories and strategic success are not always the same thing. A navy can win engagements, but still struggle inside a larger geopolitical framework designed to keep the pressure constant. The message sent to Gulf states. Now let's talk about something that may become one of the most important consequences of this crisis: the psychological message sent across the Gulf region. Because when energy infrastructure inside Allied territory comes under threat, every regional government starts reassessing risk. Publicly, Gulf allies will continue emphasizing partnership and stability. That's expected. But privately, the calculations become more complicated. Because the message behind attacks on strategic infrastructure is not just military. It's political. The message is, no location connected to this conflict is fully insulated from retaliation. And that matters, especially for countries balancing relationships with Washington, while also trying to avoid becoming direct targets inside a regional confrontation. This is why back-channel diplomacy becomes extremely important during crises like this. Public speeches tell one story, private negotiations often tell another, and history shows that regional powers frequently begin searching for de-escalation pathways once economic infrastructure starts facing sustained risk. Because energy markets hate uncertainty, investors hate uncertainty, governments hate uncertainty, and prolonged instability in the Gulf creates all three simultaneously. That's why the next few weeks may matter far more diplomatically than militarily. The visible conflict is happening on screens. The invisible conflict is happening in meetings, phone calls, security discussions, economic negotiations. That's where long-term outcomes are usually shaped. The real danger is miscalculation. Now here's the part that security analysts worry about most. Not necessarily intentional escalation. Miscalculation. History shows that major regional conflicts often grow from moments where multiple sides believe they're still operating below the threshold of full war. One side signals strength, the other side responds, then another response follows, and suddenly the escalation ladder moves faster than anyone expected. That risk becomes even greater in crowded operational environments. Warships, drones, fast attack boats, commercial vessels, air patrols, electronic warfare systems, everything operating in close proximity under intense pressure. One radar mistake, one targeting error, One overreaction. That's all it takes. And this is why the current situation feels different from many previous Gulf tensions. The operational environment is more technologically dense, more politically sensitive, and economically more dangerous. At the same time, every major actor involved is trying to avoid appearing weak. America wants deterrence, Iran wants leverage, regional states want stability, Russia and China want strategic advantage without direct military exposure, and global markets want the crisis to disappear entirely. Those objectives do not naturally align. That's why this situation remains so unpredictable, because every side believes it's managing escalation carefully. But history is filled with moments where leaders believed exactly that, right before events spiraled beyond control. The economic war underneath the military one. Now let's look at the layer most people never see. The economic battlefield underneath the military headlines. Every day, instability continues in Hormuz. The financial effects spread globally. Energy prices, shipping costs, insurance premiums, supply chains, inflation pressure. And once those economic effects begin impacting multiple continents simultaneously, the political consequences follow. Governments face pressure from voters. Businesses demand stability. Central banks monitor inflation risk, all from one narrow stretch of water. This is why some analysts describe modern energy choke points as economic weapons as much as geographic ones, because controlling stability around those routes influences the global economy itself. And here's where things become strategically fascinating. Countries less dependent on Hormuz disruption may actually gain leverage, while others absorb the costs. That creates an imbalance. One side spends billions securing maritime routes. Another side benefits from higher energy revenue. A third side positions itself diplomatically as a mediator. And suddenly, the battlefield extends far beyond military exchanges. Now it becomes about endurance. Who can sustain pressure longer? Who absorbs economic pain better? Who controls alternative trade systems? Who can outlast the political pressure at home? That's the deeper contest unfolding here, and it's why the next phase of this crisis may depend less on missiles and more on economics. The dual-track strategy. One of the most overlooked aspects of this entire situation is that military escalation and diplomatic outreach are happening simultaneously, and that's extremely important. While military exchanges dominate headlines, diplomatic communication reportedly continues behind closed doors. Regional intermediaries, international discussions, potential de-escalation proposals, back-channel negotiations. Now, why does that matter? Because it suggests all sides understand the risks of uncontrolled escalation, even while demonstrating strength publicly. This creates what analysts sometimes call a dual-track strategy. Pressure and negotiation operating together, military signaling on one side, diplomatic flexibility on the other. That combination can either create opportunities for resolution or produce even greater confusion if trust collapses. And this is where perception becomes critical. If Iran believes it has enough leverage to negotiate from strength, its behavior changes. If America believes prolonged pressure will force concessions, its strategy changes. If Gulf states fear becoming long-term targets, their calculations change. Every actor is constantly reassessing the balance. That's why the coming weeks may be defined less by dramatic explosions and more by subtle political shifts. Watch the language, watch diplomatic visits, watch energy agreements, watch whether public rhetoric begins softening. Because in geopolitical crises, the first signs of major strategic change usually appear quietly long before headlines recognize them. What Project Freedom may really reveal. So after looking at all of this together, what does Project Freedom actually reveal? Possibly something much larger than a single military operation. It reveals how modern geopolitical conflicts are no longer isolated events. Military operations, energy markets, trade routes, diplomacy, technology, economic pressure, alliance systems. They're all connected, and that means victory itself becomes harder to define. Because what counts as success? Protecting shipping for 1 week, deterring attacks temporarily, preventing regional escalation, maintaining global energy stability. Those are different objectives, and achieving one does not automatically achieve the others. That's the core challenge facing every major power involved in this situation. The battlefield is no longer just physical. It's financial, political, diplomatic, informational, and strategic. Now here's the biggest takeaway. The most powerful countries in the world are increasingly competing through indirect pressure instead of direct confrontation. Proxy leverage, economic influence, strategic partnerships, energy systems, diplomatic positioning. That's the real architecture shaping modern conflicts. And once you start viewing events through that lens, the headlines look very different, because suddenly the question is no longer who fired first. The question becomes, who benefits if the crisis continues? That's the question governments rarely answer publicly, but it's the question strategists never stop asking privately. And right now, the answer to that question may determine whether Project Freedom becomes a short-term operation or the beginning of a much longer geopolitical contest. Now, I want your perspective. What part of this entire picture stands out to you the most? The speed of the Iranian response, the energy market angle, the Russia-Iran strategic alignment, the pressure on Gulf allies, or the possibility that this crisis is as much economic as military? Comment below. And if you want analysis that goes beyond headlines and breaks down the deeper strategic picture shaping global events, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next developments in this story may not arrive the way official briefings expect, and understanding the structure behind the headlines is becoming more important than ever.